In this video, I want to introduce you to smart filters and by default to smart objects, which are closely related. In a sense, they are the same thing, but they more are two things that operate together. So smart filters are an amazing way to apply filters and other areas of Photoshop, such as transformations, non-destructively, smart filters and smart objects. They can get a little bit confusing. They actually do take up an enormous amount of space, so you want to be prepared for some larger files, but they are quite fantastic. It's a relatively new feature that's added to Photoshop in order to manage the areas that have historically been super destructive. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and get started. This is an image that I have worked on using smart filters. I'm going to go ahead and back out so you can see what the image looked like originally. This is just a normal curves layer, and this is the layer where I actually added all of my smart filters. So I started with this original image of a black Phoebe sort of hiding behind a leaf. I liked it, but I thought it could be more dramatic and dynamic. But I didn't want to actually have to do a lot of destructive editing on the image. I wanted to do some motion blur and some shadows and highlights and some other things. And so I wanted to go ahead and work with this with smart filters. You might remember up here, we actually have this convert for smart filters. And I'm going to go ahead and do this to this bottom layer. I saved a copy of the layer. Although, as one of my friends said to me who teaches Photoshop, he says, you don't really have to do that when you have a smart filter, because a smart filter is like a little suit of armor around your image. But out of habit, I always have an extra layer. And it's handy now because I can show you how we convert for smart filters and what it looks like. So I'm converting it for smart filters, which means that, as you read, it is becoming a smart object. Down here, if I hold this here, you can see it's a little hard to see on the screen, but if I hover over this, it's going to show you that this is the smart object thumbnail. You know that something has become a smart object because it'll have this little thumbnail in the bottom corner that tells you it is a smart object. Now, I'm going to go ahead and Command Z because I don't actually need for that bottom layer to be a smart object, because I made this next layer into a smart object and added smart filters. So let's go ahead and click that on, so you can see what we did here. So on this smart object, I actually went ahead and added some motion blur and some shadows and some highlights just to make this more dramatic. I also added a mask, which we can do on our smart filters. The mask, of course, has to apply to all of the filters that apply there. But let's go ahead and click these off because I can show you what I did individually. There's the shadows and the highlights, and there's the motion blur. So I can actually click on, let's click on the motion blur and show you what's really exciting about this, which is that I can click on the motion blur and bring that window, which is familiar to you, back up and change it. So I can continue to edit this motion blur even after I've applied it. I don't have to make a new layer. I don't have to backtrack. I can actually simply work with this smart object to change what I want to do. Now, I'm not going to change that. I'm going to go ahead and cancel it, but I could. Same thing here with the shadows and highlights. I can click here and notice that it's not going to show me the motion blur while we look at the shadows and the highlights, but we can still control what's going on with our shadows and highlights here and here. I'm going to cancel that out as well because I don't actually want to change it. The third thing that I want to point out to you, the third and fourth thing, here with motion blur, notice that if I go over here, it says that this is my blending options. Remember blending modes? So if I click on this, you see that my blending mode on this particular one is normal, but I could actually experiment with a different blending mode. My opacity, though, is also slightly less. So you notice if I up my opacity on the filter that I'm using, it's far more dramatic. And I might go ahead and up that a little bit. My blending mode, I'm going to leave the same. And I also can check my blending mode here. And notice that this is actually a color dodge at this point. Sorry, not color burn, color dodge. And the opacity is 45%. So quite different. And I'm going to go ahead and leave it a little bit there. Let's go ahead and play with, I'm going to go ahead and try the overlay and a little bit less on the opacity. Let's see what that looks like. Yeah, so I can really play with that. So I can experiment with the opacities. I can continue to change this. Now, the last thing I did here before I move to the final image is I actually added a mask. And the mask, you can see, I can show you the mask itself. I actually just used to very subtly sort of take out some of the blurring of the bird so that he didn't get lost, because he was getting lost before. And again, because this is a mask, I can go back in with my brush, make sure I'm on black, and I can continue if I decide, oh, I really want even more of that sort of revealed out. I can do that. Okay, so you can see I can continue as long as I leave this set up. If I save this like this, I can come in, I can change, I can manipulate it, completely non-destructive. I don't even need this layer here. All of my non-destructive capabilities are here on this layer with this smart object. This is really just barely an introduction to smart objects. They can get a little bit more complicated. I'm not going to go there yet, but please take some time to experiment with them. I can also, once I have that, I can actually add other layers that are normal layers. This is just a regular curves layer that I brought in to emphasize the bird. This is an adjustment layer, not an adjustment to the image. So it also is completely non-destructive, and I can play with that. And I think I will just a little bit, make it a little slightly less dramatic. And there you go. A really, really exciting way to work non-destructively with filters.